Jake Rodriguez had spent the last 3 years climbing his way up the professional boxing rankings. At 26, he was known in the circuit for two things: his devastating left hook and his explosive temper. The anger that fueled his fighting career had also cost him relationships, sponsorships, and respect from people who mattered. Today, that same anger was threatening to boil over as he stood in the sweltering heat of Arlington National Cemetery, waiting for what he considered a pointless ceremony to begin. He hadn't wanted to come here. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago from the Veterans Administration, asking him to attend a special memorial service for his late father, Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, who had died in Afghanistan when Jake was just 15. Jake had thrown the letter in the trash initially, but his mother had fished it out and begged him to go. She reminded him that his father had always talked about wanting to be honored at Arlington, and that this was their chance to finally say goodbye properly. The July heat was unbearable, and Jake tugged at the collar of the suit his mother had forced him to wear. Around him, families of fallen soldiers gathered with flowers and photographs, their faces showing the kind of reverence that Jake couldn't understand. To him, his father had been absent for most of his childhood, away on deployments, and then gone forever. The military had taken his father away from their family, and now they wanted to honor him with ceremonies and flags. It felt like a cruel joke. As they approached the tomb of the unknown soldier, Jake's irritation grew stronger. The tourists with their cameras, the strict rules about silence and respect, the guards who moved like robots, everything about it felt fake and rehearsed to him. His mother, Alina, walked beside him, clutching a small photo of Miguel in his dress uniform. She had aged 10 years in the past decade, working 2 jobs to support them after the military death benefits ran out. Jake blamed the army for that. 2. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, but Jake was already planning his escape. He figured he could endure whatever speeches they had planned, get through the flag presentation, and then get his mother home before dark. He had a training session scheduled for the next morning. His coach had been pushing him hard for his upcoming fight against Danny Morrison. A bout that could determine whether his career continued or ended in disappointment like so many others. Alina noticed her son's restlessness and placed her hand on his arm. "Please, mijo," she whispered in Spanish. "Do this for your father. Do this for me." Jake looked down at his mother's weathered hands that had worked in factory lines and cleaned office buildings to keep them afloat after Miguel's death. He felt a familiar stab of guilt, the same feeling that always came when he thought about how hard his mother's life had become. But instead of softening his heart, the guilt only fed his anger at the circumstances that had brought them here. The tomb guard on duty was Specialist First Class Tommy Chen, a 23-year-old from California who had volunteered for this assignment after losing his best friend in Iraq. Tommy had spent 8 months training for this role, learning every movement, every tradition, every meaning behind the ceremony that thousands of visitors witnessed each year. For him, this wasn't just a job or a duty, it was a sacred trust. Between him and every service member who had died without recognition, as families began to gather closer to the tomb, Jake noticed how everyone seemed to know exactly how to behave except him. People spoke in whispers, moved carefully, and watched the guard with something approaching worship. Jake had never understood hero worship, especially for people who chose to put themselves in danger. In his world, strength meant taking care of yourself and your own, not dying for strangers in foreign countries. The preliminary ceremonies began with a chaplain offering prayers that Jake didn't listen to. Instead, he found himself studying the faces around him, wondering what they got out of all this ritual and pageantry. He saw older veterans standing at attention despite their age and physical limitations, their eyes bright with unshed tears. He saw young widows with children who would never remember their fathers, holding folded flags like precious treasures. He saw Gold Star mothers who had given their sons to wars they might not have even understood. Alina had begun crying softly during the chaplain's prayer, and Jake awkwardly put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and he could feel how thin she had become, how the years of worry and work had worn her down. His anger shifted slightly, focusing less on the ceremony and more on the unfairness of a world that took fathers away from families and left mothers to struggle alone. But even that anger felt familiar and comfortable compared to the strange emotions that the ceremony was starting to stir up in places he had kept carefully locked away. The crowd grew larger as the formal changing of the guard approached. Jake found himself pressed closer to the barriers that separated the tourists from the sacred space around the tomb. From this distance, he could see every detail of Tommy Chun's uniform, every careful step of his measured walk. South, turn and face east for 21 seconds. 21 steps north, turn and face west for 21 seconds. The precision was impressive from a technical standpoint, Jake admitted grudgingly, but it still felt like an elaborate performance to him. What Jake didn't know was that each of those 21 steps represented a gun salute, that the 21 seconds of waiting honored the highest military honor guard. He didn't know that Tommy Chen had practiced this routine in rain, snow, and blazing heat, that guards had maintained this vigil continuously since 1937, or that the unknown soldier represented every service member whose sacrifice had gone unrecognized. To Jake, it was just a young man in a perfect uniform following a script that someone else had written decades ago. As the official ceremony time approached, Jake's restlessness reached its peak. The heat, the crowd, the weight of emotions he didn't want to feel, and the mounting pressure of being somewhere he didn't want to be, all combined into a familiar rage. He had learned long ago that anger was easier than sadness, that fighting was simpler than feeling, and that walking away was safer than staying vulnerable. His hands clenched into fists almost automatically, a response his body had learned through years of channeling pain into aggression. Alina sensed her son's tension and looked up at him with worried eyes. She had seen this look before, usually. Right before Jake got into trouble. "Please don't leave me here alone," she whispered, her voice so quiet that only he could hear. Those words stopped him cold, reminding him that whatever his feelings about the ceremony, his mother needed him. Here, for her sake, he would try to endure whatever came next, even if every instinct told him to run. The changing of the guard ceremony began with a precision that immediately caught Jake's attention, despite his resistance. Tommy Chen executed each movement with the kind of discipline that Jake recognized from his own training, though this was different from anything he had seen in the boxing world. Every step was exactly 21 inches, measured not by sight but by muscle memory developed through months of relentless practice. The rifle on Tommy's shoulder never wavered, and his face showed no emotion as he continued the ritual that had been performed continuously for decades. Jake found himself, grudgingly, pressed by the physical control required for such precision. As someone who had dedicated his life to mastering his body's movements, he could appreciate the countless hours of training that went into making each step look effortless. But his admiration was mixed with frustration. All that discipline and dedication seemed wasted on what was essentially a performance for tourists with cameras and crying. Relatives who couldn't let go of the past, the crowd around them had grown silent, and Jake could hear only the sound of Tommy's boots on the stone and the distant hum of traffic from the city beyond the cemetery. His mother continued to clutch the photograph of his father, and Jake noticed that she was mouthing words silently. He realized she was praying, something she had done more frequently since Miguel's death, but which Jake had always ignored or found reasons to avoid witnessing. Alina had met Miguel when they were both 19, and he had been the love of her life from their first date. When he deployed for the first time, she had promised to wait for him. And she had kept that promise through 3 deployments and countless nights of worry. After his death, she had never even considered dating again. Telling Jake that some loves were meant to last forever, Jake had always thought this was foolish, that she was wasting her life on a memory. But watching her now, he began to understand the depth of her loss in a way he never had before. The relief ceremony was about to begin, and Jake could see another guard approaching from the amphitheater. This guard moved with the same measured precision as Tommy, and Jake realized that somewhere, probably underground, there were more guards preparing for their shifts, maintaining a tradition that never paused for weather, holidays, or personal tragedy. The commitment required for such dedication was something Jake had never encountered in his own life, where everything had always been about personal achievement and individual glory. As the relief guard approached, Tommy began the inspection ritual that was part of every changing ceremony. Jake watched as the new guard's rifle was examined with microscopic attention to detail. Every buckle and button checked for perfection. The tourists around him seemed to hold their breath during this process, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something sacred, even if they didn't fully understand its meaning. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, and without thinking, he pulled it out to check the message. It was from his trainer, asking about his preparation for the upcoming fight. Jake began typing a response, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen. The clicking sound of his keyboard seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, and he noticed several people turning to look at him with expressions of disapproval. His mother gently touched his arm and shook her head, but Jake was already irritated by what he saw as arbitrary rules about behavior. "It's just a phone," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough that people nearby could hear. "It's not like I'm hurting anyone." An elderly woman in front of him turned around and fixed him with a stare that reminded him of his elementary school principal, but Jake stared back defiantly. He had never responded well to authority, especially when he couldn't see the logic. Behind the rules he was expected to follow, Tommy Chen had completed his final walk and was now standing at attention, preparing for the relief ceremony to begin. But Jake's phone activity and muttered comments had not gone unnoticed. The guard's training had taught him to ignore distractions, to maintain his composure regardless of what happened around him. But something about the disrespect being shown during such a solemn moment struck him deeply. This wasn't just about military protocol, it was about honor and remembrance for people who could no longer speak for themselves. The relief ceremony proceeded with its usual precision, but Jake had become increasingly agitated by what he saw as pointless formality. When the guards began their synchronized movements, he rolled his eyes dramatically and shifted his weight from foot to foot like a restless child. His mother's embarrassment was visible to everyone around them, but Jake was too focused on his own discomfort to notice how his behavior was affecting her. "This is ridiculous," Jake said, his voice carrying further than he intended. "All this marching around and saluting for someone who's been dead for decades? What's the point?" Came out louder than he had meant them to, cutting through the reverent silence like a slap. Elena's face went pale, and she grabbed his arm urgently, trying to quiet him. But Jake was past the point of being controlled by social expectations. Several veterans in the crowd turned to face him, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Too deep hurt. One old man, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, shook his head sadly and whispered something to his wife about disrespectful young people. But Jake was beyond caring about the opinions of strangers. In his mind, he was trapped in a situation he hadn't chosen. Participating in a ritual that meant nothing to him, honoring a father who had chosen duty over family, and paid the ultimate price for that choice. Tommy Chen heard every word. His training had prepared him for many types of disruptions, but this level of open disrespect during a memorial ceremony was something that cut him to the core. The unknown soldier he guarded represented every service member who had died without recognition, every family that had lost someone to war, every sacrifice that had been made for the freedom that allowed this angry young man to speak his mind. Without fear of persecution, the relief ceremony concluded, and the new guard took his position to begin his shift. But Tommy didn't immediately retreat to the amphitheater as protocol demanded. He remained at attention, his mind racing as he considered what to do about the disruption that was clearly affecting everyone present. Jake's comments had created a tension in the crowd that threatened to undermine the sacred nature of the ceremony, and Tommy felt a responsibility to address it. Jake, meanwhile, had decided he had seen enough. "Come on, Mom," he said loudly, taking Elena's arm and beginning to guide her away from the tomb. "Let's get out of here before I say something that really offends these toy soldiers." His words were calculated to provoke, driven by a combination of heat, frustration, and the deep-seated anger that had been his constant companion since his father's death. He wanted to hurt someone the way he had been hurt, and these guards with their perfect uniforms and rigid ceremonies made perfect targets. Elena resisted his pull, her eyes wide with horror at her son's behavior. "Jake, please," she whispered. "Urgently, your father would be so ashamed. These men are honoring the dead. They're honoring him." But Jake was beyond reasoning. his anger feeding on itself as it always did when he felt cornered or forced into situations that made him uncomfortable. The boxing ring had taught him that the best defense was a strong offense, and he was applying that lesson now. Tommy Chen made a decision that would violate every protocol he had been taught. As Jake began to lead his mother away from the ceremony, the guard stepped forward and called out in a voice that carried across the entire plaza, "Sir, please stop." The words cut through the air like a command, causing every head to turn toward the unfolding confrontation. Jake froze in his tracks, his body automatically responding to the authority in Tommy's voice before his mind could catch up and rebel against it. The crowd sensed that something unprecedented was about to happen. Guards at the tomb of the unknown. Soldier never broke protocol, never engaged with visitors during ceremonies, never stepped outside their prescribed roles. But here was Tommy Chen, still in perfect uniform, standing between his post and an angry civilian who had just insulted everything he had dedicated his life to protecting. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Jake turned around slowly, his hands already clenching into fists. Here was someone finally willing to confront him, someone who thought a uniform gave him the right to tell Jake what to do. All the frustration and rage that had been building inside him for years suddenly had a target, and Jake felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that preceded every fight. His mother called his name in warning, but he was already moving back toward the tomb, his body language promising violence. "You got something to say to me?" Jake snarled, his voice carrying the threat that had intimidated opponents in the ring and troublemakers on the street. He was bigger than the guard, broader through the shoulders, and clearly more experienced in physical confrontation. Tommy Chen looked young and clean-cut, the kind of person Jake had been bullying since high school. The boxer expected the guard to back down, to retreat behind his ceremonial duties, and let Jake leave with his pride intact. Tommy Chen stood his ground as Jake approached, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a calm determination that Jake hadn't expected. The guard's hands remained at his sides, showing no intention of fighting, but his posture conveyed a strength that had nothing to do with physical intimidation. When Jake got close enough to smell the starch in Tommy's uniform, the guard spoke in a voice that was quiet but somehow carried to every person watching. "Sir, I want you to know that the man buried in this tomb was probably about your age when he died," Tommy said, his words measured and deliberate. "He might have had a mother who loved him the way your mother loves you. He might have had dreams, plans for after the war, someone waiting for him to come home. But we'll never know any of that, because he gave his life for people he never met, in a place he might never have chosen to be." Jake was prepared for a confrontation, ready for an argument, or even a physical fight. What he wasn't prepared for was the steady compassion in Tommy's voice, or the way the guard's words seemed to cut through his anger and find something deeper underneath. Jake demanded, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "My father chose to go to war. He chose duty over his family. He left us to deal with everything while he played soldier." Tommy nodded slowly, acknowledging Jake's pain without dismissing it. "Maybe he did choose duty," the guard replied. "But maybe he chose it because he believed that his sacrifice could prevent other fathers from having to make the same choice. Maybe he thought that by going to war, he could help create a world where his son wouldn't have to." In the air between them, and Jake felt something shifting inside him, a crack appearing in the wall of anger he had built around his heart. Alina had moved closer during their exchange, still clutching Miguel's photograph. She looked up at her son with tears streaming down her face, and for the first time, Jake really saw the depth of her pain. "He used to write letters about you," she said softly. Every deployment, he would write about how proud he was of you. How he hoped the war would end before you were old enough to serve. He was trying to make the world safer for you, mijo. Jake turned to look at his mother, really look at her, and saw not just the tired woman who had raised him alone, but the young bride who had said goodbye to her husband for the last time at an airport 10 years ago. He saw the woman who had received the knock on the door that every military wife dreaded, who had accepted a folded flag in place of the man she loved. For the first time, Jake began to understand that his anger at his father's absence had blinded him to his mother's much greater loss. Tommy continued speaking, his voice gentle but unwavering. "Sir, I don't know your father's story, but I know he wore the same uniform I wear. And I know that every person who puts on this uniform makes a choice to put others before themselves. That doesn't make them perfect, and it doesn't erase the pain their families feel when they don't come home. But it does make them worthy of honor." The crowd around them had grown completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just about military protocol or ceremony anymore. It was about grief and loss, about a son's anger and a mother's love, about the price that families pay for freedom they might never fully appreciate. Other visitors began to see their own stories. Reflected in the confrontation unfolding before them, Jake felt his carefully constructed anger beginning to crumble. And underneath it was a pain he had been avoiding for 10 years. The pain of a 15-year-old boy who had needed his father and felt abandoned by his choice to serve. The pain of watching his mother struggle alone while dealing with his own confusion and grief. The pain of growing up feeling like he had to be angry to be strong, like vulnerability was a weakness he couldn't afford. "I was 15 when he died," Jake said, his voice breaking slightly. 15 and angry, and I blamed him for leaving us. I blamed the army for taking him. I blamed everyone except the people who actually killed him, because that felt too big and too far away to understand. The admission surprised him, coming out before he could stop it. He'd never said these words out loud, not even to his mother, not even to himself. Tommy's expression softened further, and Jake could see understanding in the younger man's eyes. 15 is too young to lose a father, Tommy said simply. And anger is easier than grief, especially when you're trying to be strong for everyone else. But your father's sacrifice doesn't diminish because you were angry about it. Your pain doesn't dishonor his memory. They can both be true at the same time. Alina reached out and took her son's hand, something she hadn't done since he was a child. "Your father knew you were angry," she said quietly. "In his last letter, he wrote that he hoped someday you would understand why he had to go," he said. "He wasn't fighting for the government or for politics. He was fighting for the right of his son to choose his own path, even if that path included being angry at his father's choices." Jake looked down at their joined hands, his mother's small and work-worn, his own large and scarred from years of fighting. He thought about all the times she had supported his boxing career, driving him to gyms and competitions, cheering for him even when he lost, never asking him to choose between his dreams and her needs the way he had felt forced to choose between his father and his family. She had carried the burden of both parents for 10 years, and he had never thanked her for it. The moments stretched between them as Jake struggled with emotions he had spent years suppressing. Tommy Chen remained at attention, but his eyes held a compassion that reached across the divide between civilian and soldier, between grief and duty. Around them, the crowd waited in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple disruption of ceremony. "I never got to say goodbye to him," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "One day he was there, telling me to take care of Mom while he was gone. And then there was just a chaplain at our door with news that changed everything. I was supposed to be the man of the house, but I was just a scared kid who wanted his father back." The words came out in a rush, 10 years of suppressed emotion finally finding voice. Tommy nodded slowly, understanding more than Jake realized. "I lost my best friend in Iraq," he said quietly, Danny Martinez. "We grew up together, enlisted together, served together. When the IED hit our convoy, I was the one who held him while he died. He was 22 years old, and his last words were about his little sister back home and how he hoped she would understand why he couldn't come back to teach her to drive like he had promised." Alina gasped softly at Tommy's words, recognizing the pain of sudden loss that she knew so well. She stepped closer to both young men, her maternal instincts responding to the grief she saw in both their faces. "How do you carry that?" she asked. Tommy, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "How do you come here every day and honor the dead when it must remind you of your own loss?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the white marble tomb behind him. "At first I couldn't," he admitted. "I requested this assignment because I thought, if I could guard the unknown soldier, I could somehow guard Danny's memory too. But for months, every step I took felt like I was walking on his grave. Every ceremony felt like a reminder that he was gone and I was still here." Jake found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested in Tommy's answer for the first time since the confrontation began. Here was someone who understood loss, who had chosen to face it daily rather than run from it. "What changed?" Jake asked, his anger replaced by curiosity. "I realized that honor isn't about the dead," Tommy replied, his words careful and thoughtful. "It's about the living. When I stand guard here, I'm not doing it for the unknown soldier. He's beyond needing my protection. I'm doing it for every mother who lost a son, every child who grew up without a father, every person who needs to believe that sacrifice means something. I'm doing it for people like your mother, who need to know that their loved one's death had purpose." Lena began crying harder now, not from sadness, but from a kind of relief. For 10 years, she had struggled with the question of whether Miguel's death had meant anything, whether his sacrifice had been worth the pain it had caused their family. Hearing Tommy's words, she began to understand that the meaning wasn't in the death itself, but in how the living chose to honor it. Jake felt his worldview beginning to shift in ways that frightened and confused him. Everything he had believed about strength and independence, about the futility of sacrifice and the importance of looking out for yourself first, was being challenged by this young guard who had chosen to dedicate his life to honoring strangers. "But what about the people left behind?" Jake asked. "What about the families who have to pick up the pieces?" "They're the real heroes," Tommy answered without hesitation. "Your mother, who raised you alone after losing the love of her life. You, who carried anger for 10 years because it was easier than admitting how much you missed your father. A family member who chooses to keep living and loving after losing someone to service. You're the ones who carry the real weight." Jake looked at his mother with new eyes, seeing for the first time the strength it had taken for her to rebuild their lives after Miguel's death. She had worked multiple jobs, attended every school event, celebrated his victories and comforted him through defeats, all while dealing with her own grief and loneliness. She had been both mother and father to him, and he had never acknowledged the enormity of that sacrifice. "Mom," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I've been so angry for so long. I'm sorry I blamed Dad for dying instead of thanking him for living." Alina reached up and touched her son's face, her own tears mixing with his as 10 years of unspoken pain finally found expression. Tommy stepped back slightly, understanding that this moment belonged to the family, not to him. But Jake turned to include him in their reconciliation. "And I'm sorry for disrespecting this place," Jake said to Tommy. "I didn't understand what it meant. I thought it was just about following rules and putting on a show. Didn't realize it was about love." The crowd around them had been transformed. By witnessing this exchange, what had begun as disapproval for Jake's behavior had evolved into recognition of a family finding healing in an unexpected place. Several other visitors were crying now, thinking of their own losses and their own struggles with grief and anger. The ceremony had become something more than ritual. It had become a reminder of what it meant to be human in the face of loss. Tommy Chun had broken protocol by engaging with Jake, but as he looked at the mother and son embracing beside the tomb, he knew he had made the right choice. The rigid discipline of his training had taught him to follow orders without question, but his humanity had taught him that some moments required more than following rules. This was one of those moments when the spirit of his duty mattered more than the letter of it. Jake pulled back from his mother's embrace and looked around at the faces watching them. Instead of the judgment he expected, he saw understanding and compassion. An elderly veteran approached them slowly, his own eyes wet with tears. "Son," the old man said, placing a weathered hand on Jake's shoulder, I lost my father in Vietnam when I was 16. Spent 30 years being angry about it. Before I learned what your young guard here just taught you, anger's just love with nowhere to go." Alina listened to the veteran's words and felt a piece of her own healing begin. For a decade, she had carried not only her own grief but worry about her son's anger. She had watched him throw himself into boxing not because he loved the sport, but because it gave him a place to release the rage that consumed him. Now, seeing him finally acknowledge his pain, she felt hope for the first time in years that they might find their way back to each other. Tommy knew he needed to return to his duties, but he felt compelled to share one more thing with Jake. "Your father's name is Miguel Rodriguez, isn't it?" Jake's eyes widened in surprise. "How could this stranger know his father's name?" Tommy continued. "3 months ago, I received a letter from a soldier who served with your father in Afghanistan. He told me that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez saved 6 men's lives on the day he died, and that those men all made it home to their families because of his actions." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. In all his anger and resentment, he had never sought out details about his father's death. The official reports had been too painful for his mother to discuss, and Jake had been too angry to ask. Now, learning that his father had died saving others, that his sacrifice had meant that 6 other families didn't have to experience what they had endured, changed everything. "The soldier who wrote to me said that your father talked about you all the time," Tommy continued. "He said Miguel carried your boxing gloves with him as a good luck charm, and that he showed pictures of your fights to everyone in his unit. He was proud of you, sir. Even when you were angry at him, even when you thought he had abandoned you, he was proud of you." Lena gasped and pulled out her purse, fumbling through it until she found a small plastic bag. Inside were Miguel's personal effects that had been returned to them after his death, items she had been too heartbroken to examine closely. With shaking hands, she pulled out a pair of small boxing gloves, the ones Jake had worn in his first amateur fight at age 12. They were worn and faded from being carried in Miguel's pocket through 2 deployments. Jake stared at the tiny gloves, remembering the day his father had given them to him. Miguel had been home on leave, and he had spent the entire weekend teaching Jake how to throw proper punches, how to protect himself, how to channel his energy into something positive. "These will remind you that fighting is about protecting what matters," Miguel had told him. "Not about hurting people because you're hurt." The weight of understanding settled on Jake's shoulders like a heavy blanket. His father hadn't abandoned them. He had carried them with him every day, even into battle. The anger that Jake had nursed for 10 years suddenly felt small and misplaced. Miguel hadn't chosen war over family. He had chosen to fight so that his family could live in peace, even if it meant he might not be there to see it. Tommy watched. The realization dawned on Jake's face and felt a profound satisfaction that had nothing to do with following orders or maintaining traditions. This was why he had chosen to become a tomb guard, for moments like this, when the ceremony transcended ritual and became about real human connection and healing. "Your father's sacrifice is honored here every day," Tommy said gently. "Not because he's buried in this tomb, but because what he did represents what the unknown soldier did, giving everything for others." Jake reached out tentatively and took the small boxing gloves from his mother's hands. It felt impossibly light, but somehow they carried the weight of his father's love and sacrifice. "I've been so angry for so long," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "I thought being angry made me strong, made me like him. But he wasn't angry. He was brave. There's a difference." Alina watched her son hold his father's good luck charm and felt a transformation happening that she had prayed for every night since Miguel's death. Jake was finally allowing himself to grieve properly, to feel the loss without the protective barrier of rage that had kept him isolated from everyone who loved him. "Your father would be so proud of the man you're becoming," she whispered, and, for the first time in years, Jake believed her. The crowd around them had grown larger as word of the unusual confrontation spread through the cemetery. But instead of feeling exposed or embarrassed, Jake felt supported by the community of people who understood loss and sacrifice. Veterans nodded at him with recognition, seeing their own journeys from anger to acceptance reflected in his transformation. Families who had lost loved ones in service stepped closer, creating a circle of understanding around the mother and son. Tommy knew that his supervisors would probably question his decision to break protocol, but he also knew that this was what the tomb of the unknown soldier truly represented, not rigid adherence to rules, but the human connections that make sacrifice meaningful. "Sir," he said to Jake, "would you and your mother like to place your father's photo near the tomb? It's not part of the official ceremony, but I think he would be honored to be remembered here." Jake looked at the photograph in his mother's hands. Seeing his father's young face smiling back at him, Miguel had been only 28 when the picture was taken, just 2 years older than Jake was now. For the first time, Jake saw his father not as an authority figure who had abandoned him, but as a young man who had been trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. "Yes," Jake said, his voice steady for the first time all day. "I think he would like that." Tommy Chen escorted Jake and Alina to a designated area near the tomb, where family members were allowed to leave tributes. As they walked the short distance, Jake noticed details about the memorial that he had missed before. The precision of the landscaping, the careful maintenance of every stone and metal surface, the way other guards moved with the same purposeful dignity that Tommy displayed. This wasn't just a tourist attraction or a ceremonial duty, it was a living monument to sacrifice and remembrance. Alina placed Miguel's photograph gently against the base of the tomb, her hands trembling as she whispered a prayer in Spanish. Jake knelt beside her and placed the small boxing gloves next to the photo, creating a simple but powerful tribute to a father and a husband who had died far from home. The gesture felt more meaningful than any formal ceremony could have been, because it came from the heart rather than from obligation. As they stood together in silence, Jake felt a profound shift in his understanding of strength and courage. For years, he had defined these qualities through his ability to inflict damage in the boxing ring, to intimidate opponents and overcome challenges through aggression. But watching Tommy's calm dignity in the face of his anger, seeing his mother's quiet endurance through years of loss, Jake began to understand that true strength often looked nothing like what he had imagined. Tommy returned to his post but continued to watch the family from the corner of his eye. His own journey to this place had been marked by anger and confusion, and he recognized the same struggle in Jake that he had faced after losing Danny Martinez. The difference was that Tommy had found a way to channel his grief into service, while Jake had been channeling his into destruction, but people found healing in different ways. And Tommy sensed that Jake was finally ready to begin his own journey toward peace. Other visitors began to approach. The small memorial that Jake and Alina had created. Veterans left coins and small flags, a tradition that spoke to the brotherhood of service that transcended individual wars and conflicts. A young woman whose husband had died in Iraq left a folded letter beside Miguel's photo. An elderly man who had served in Korea saluted briefly before moving on. Each gesture was small, but together they created a community of remembrance that surrounded Jake and his mother with support. Alina watched the tributes accumulate around her husband's photograph and felt a warmth she hadn't experienced since his death. For 10 years, she had felt alone in her grief, isolated by the fact that most people in their community hadn't understood military loss. But here, surrounded by people who had experienced similar pain, she felt understood and supported. "Miguel would have loved this," she whispered to Jake. "He always said that the best thing about the military was the way strangers became family." Jake spent the next hour listening to stories from other military families. He heard about deployments that lasted longer than expected, about children who grew up knowing their parents only through video calls, about the constant fear that lived in the hearts of military spouses. But he also heard about reunions that made the separation worthwhile, about the pride that families felt in their loved ones' service, about the way military communities supported each other through the hardest times. A young Marine approached them hesitantly, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "Excuse me," he said to Jake, "but I heard what happened earlier, and I wanted to thank you. My daughter here lost her grandfather last year, my father, and she's been angry about it too. Seeing you work through your feelings about your dad, it helps me understand what she might be going through." Jake knelt down to the little girl's level, something he had never been comfortable doing before. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently.
Est.
"Sophia," she replied, her voice barely audible. Jake could see his own childhood anger reflected in her small face. The confusion and hurt that came with losing someone important before you were old enough to understand why. "I was angry when my daddy died too," Jake told her. ... But I learned today that being angry is okay for a while as long as you don't stay angry forever. The conversation with Sophia and her father gave Jake a new perspective on his own experience. Seeing his childhood grief reflected in someone else helped him understand that his anger had been a normal response to an abnormal situation. The problem hadn't been feeling angry, it had been staying angry long past the point where the anger served any useful purpose. Now, for the first time in years, he could imagine a future where his father's memory brought him peace instead of pain. As the afternoon sun began to set, Tommy's shift ended and he was relieved by another guard. Before leaving, he approached Jake and Alina one final time. "Sir, ma'am," he said formally, "it was an honor to meet you both, your husband. And father served with distinction, and his sacrifice will not be forgotten." He handed Alina a small card with information about veteran family support services, resources that might help them continue their healing journey. Jake shook Tommy's hand, a gesture that felt like the beginning of a friendship that would last far beyond this single day. "Thank you," Jake said simply. "Thank you for caring enough to break the rules. Thank you for helping me understand that my father didn't leave us, he was taken from us. There's a difference, and it matters." As they prepared to leave Arlington, Jake carried himself differently than he had when they arrived. The anger that had defined him for so long hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been transformed into something more useful, a determination to honor his father's memory by becoming the kind of man Miguel would have been proud of. Alina walked beside him with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there for years. Finally able to believe that her husband's death had meaning beyond the pain it had caused, 6 months later, Jake would use his boxing skills in a completely different way, teaching self-defense classes to military families and helping other children who had lost parents to service work through their anger and grief. He would never become a professional champion, but he would become something more important, a man who used his strength to protect and heal rather than to hurt. And every year on the anniversary of Miguel's death, Jake and Alina would return to Arlington to visit the tomb and remember the day when a young guard's courage had helped them find their way back to each other and to the love that had never really left them. Even in their darkest moments of anger and despair,